Thank you, Kate. I'm glad to be here. I hope that you can hear me. My voice doesn't carry very well, and so I'm always a little bit concerned that people in the room will be able to hear. I am glad to be here in Iowa. Probably one of the bastions of cultural diversity. I actually haven't spent too much time in Iowa, so maybe I shouldn't say that. I think it's always interesting for audiences to know how it is that a writer becomes a writer, and so I'd like to say a few things about that and then eventually get into reading some fiction. I've been working more in fiction than I have in poetry lately. And I think that one of the reasons that I started publishing my work was because I really wanted to be a literary critic. And I felt like a leech being a literary critic, critiquing other people's work, you know. I felt like a manipulator, you know, like it wasn't really honest work, you know. If you weren't out there doing it too, what right did you have to critique other people's work? However, you know, I really did want to be a literary critic, and I have become one. One of the reasons being that most of the things that you read about Indians are so terribly wrong. No one had to tell me that James Fenimore Cooper was a racist and believed in European superiority and wrote stories about that. And so I think that I wanted to say something about those kinds of things. And I felt sort of like George Bernard Shaw, I suppose, who said, you know, those people who can't write, teach. And those people who can't write become literary critics. And so I decided that maybe I ought to. Of course, he's a very arrogant man, but most literary critics are. But I really felt that I should probably publish, and that is sort of the beginning of the beginning. But what interests me too about literary criticism is that it is such a dynamic and changing discipline, much like literature is. It's very ambiguous, and you can have any kind of opinion. So when the New York Times reviewed my new novel, From the River's Edge, and trashed it in the New York Times, I said, well, you know, the ambiguity of people's opinion is okay with me. But I think that literary criticism also brings up many of the issues about literature. That is to say, it begins to help us with the argument about whether or not literature really teaches us anything, whether there is some kind of learning that goes on in literature, some kind of cognizant learning, I guess, as scholars call it. And that's part of the debate about literature. So I think that that interests me too, that idea. And very often I find that, oddly enough, people are not sure at all what literature does. In fact, I was talking to a young Indian historian at the University of California in Davis a couple, 3 weeks ago, and he had come to a reading of mine, and he said, I always like to go to poetry readings, you know, because it gets you away from academics, which was an astonishing comment, I thought. But it is a part of the debate, isn't it? And it's a part of the academic thinking that literature is kind of to be enjoyed, it's kind of entertaining, but that it really doesn't teach you anything all that much. So I think that some of those ideas have always interested me about literature and about what we think that literature is doing. And maybe we'll have some more to say about that a little bit later. In the meantime, I do want to read from Ben Badger Said This, which is probably now out of print, but I do have some copies in the back of the room. It's one of the first pieces that I published, and I think that it gives you an idea of what my interests are. You know that every writer is obsessed by something. Norman Mailer, you know, is obsessed by the macho business that goes on in America. And Woody Allen is obsessed by how large Woody Allen is obsessed by whether or not women are going to like him. Well, you know, everybody's obsessed by something. And I think that I will read this little piece to tell you what I'm obsessed about. It I think, is not what interests America. When you look at Wayne's World and you know what's going on in the world, it's very difficult to say that my obsession is going to ever be mainstream, and I certainly don't think it is. But anyway, let me read you a little piece that tells you what my obsession is, and then maybe I'll tell you a little bit about the history of it. I grew up in a place that's called the Crow Creek Indian Reservation, and spent much of my life there. And so this is a story about that. Seeing the Missouri River country of the Sioux is like seeing where the earth first recognized humanity and where it came to possess a kind of unique internal coherence about that condition. As you look, you think you see old women leaving marked trails in the tall burnt grass as they carry firewood on their backs from the river. And you think you hear the songs they sang to grandchildren, and you feel transformed into the past. But then winter comes, and the earth freezes solid, and you wish for July and the ripe plums and the sun on your eyelids. In August in 1952, I stood on a hill with Big Pipe and watched the flooding waters of the Missouri River Power Project unleash the river's power from banks which had held it and guided it since before any white man was seen in this country. As Old Pipe grieved, the water covered the trees of a timber stand which had nourished a people for all generations. And it took 20 years for those trees to die, their skeletons still and white. It took much less time for the snakes and small animals to disappear. Today, Old Pipe has a hard time finding the sikpeapa, the root which cures his toothache. And he tells everyone that it is the white man's determination to change the river which accounts for the destruction of all life's forms. When you look east from Big Pipe's place, you see Fort George. You look south and see Iron Nation, and you sense a kind of hollowness in the endless distance of the river span, at odds somehow with the immediacy of the steel REA towers stalking up and down prairie hills. Yet, as the fingertips touch the slick leaves of the milkweed and roll the juicy leaves together, it is easy to believe that this vast region continues to share its destiny with a people who have survived hard winters, invasions, migrations, and transformations unthought of and unpredicted. And even easier to know that the mythology and history of all times remains remote and believable. And for those of you who don't know too much about that history, in the 1950s and 1960s, there were 5 or 6 hydropower dams put into the Missouri River, and it changed life forever. All the way from 48th North Dakota to Iowa, Indian tribes were flooded out. And the little reservation that I come from on the Missouri River, the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation, was changed forever. And at the time that was happening also, the termination relocation period was taking place. And the U.S. Congress decided that it would pass laws that would remove Indians from their homelands. Now that didn't happen, that isn't happening in Columbus's time. That isn't happening back in the 1800s. That's happening today. It's happening as we speak. And so Indian tribes are at risk constantly. And the relocation termination period, when Congress passed laws that relocated Indian people and tried to terminate the treaty agreements with tribes, ended up having about 2/3 of all of the Indians in the country living in the cities. It was a great urbanization policy, which really sounds dumb and is dumb, but it was a part of the mid-century Indian history. And so take a course in Native American Studies, folks. Maybe some of you are already in that course and know about that. But certainly I can see in my lifetime the issues of survival for American Indians in this country. And so I think it's very interesting that I'm invited to come and speak and we're to talk about recovering Mother Earth. And we're to talk about the matters which America now is concerned about. And the real truth of the matter is that American Indians have tried to survive America for 200 years, and we are still trying to survive America. And so I'm not sure at all how much American Indians can enter into the discussion about environmentalism and other things that America concerns itself about, mostly because of the history that we have managed to survive. I think that I want to read a short story as well from my collection, which is called The Power of Horses and Other Stories. And I think that the English department has these, if anybody would like to get one. And then I'm also going to read a piece of new fiction that I have been writing. And I think that I am telling the same story over and over. Going back to the business about writers being obsessed. But I guess writers do that, William Faulkner, wrote the same story over and over and over. I would like to not do that, but it seems to be what interests me as a writer. The novel that I just has been out a few months is called From the River's Edge. And as you might imagine, it is the story of the flooding of the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation. And it tells the story of John Tatekia, who is a Santee cattleman whose land is flooded. One of the interesting things, of course, about writing stories is that you don't really have to find any solutions. You just tell the story. I guess that's also a part of the ambiguity and a part of the interest that I have in the function of literature. The story that I'm going to read is one that I wrote after I visited the reservation, which is just across the river from us. It's called the Lower Brule Indian Reservation. And it also is a little, one of the smaller reservations. You know, when you tell people that you're a Sioux, they think immediately you're from Pine Ridge and that you're Oglala. But the truth of the matter is that there are a lot of Sioux, you know, the Ihanctons and the Sichangus and the Santees and the Hunkapatis and so on. Not everybody is Oglala from Pine Ridge. I just want to make that clear. So this is a story that I wrote after I had gone to a big powwow that they had at Lower Brule. And I have a daughter who is a contest dancer, and many people in my family are dancers and singers. And so I didn't really make up this story. I mean, this is a story that I really went there and saw, believe it or not. I mean, most of the time you have to have some kind of imagination, you know, to tell a story. Not in this case. And this one is called The Clearest Blue Day. And I start by discussing a little bit about literature. And the story comes in 4 parts. That's kind of the structure of the story, 4 little parts. It is one of the strange contradictions in literature that pathos is sometimes not ordinarily felt by the anguished. Rather, it is felt by the observer, the spectator. Because this is so, I will tell you my story about a young Indian dancer, a black Christian missionary woman, and an old singer of the Wakpekute, all of whom I, as onlooker, characterize as significant figures in a changing Indian world. The 3 persons whom I have observed are fully engrossed in their lives. They are enormously compassionate, real, and accomplished. And as composite players in a modern drama with historical undertones, they exemplify in their actions the other important contradiction in life, i.e., the more things change, the more they stay the same. Number 1. It was Sunday, the last day of Wachipi. And this was the morning pause before the dancing resumed at noon. Claude walked slowly from the camp through the brittle grass, past the temporary chemical toilets and across the dirt road toward the nearly deserted dance arbor where just the night before he had made it into the finals of the men's traditional dance contest. He still wore the red wraps of his dance outfit. He was drawn to the arbor by the sounds of a mellow bass voice, the clear vibrato of a lead guitar, and the sound of what his Uncle Elgie used to call the melody sax. Only a few people were sitting in the shaded seats beneath the brilliant morning light, and without being very specific, Claude thought they looked like a sorry lot. There was a woman who looked about 40, her straight black hair oddly red-tinged, her brown hand covered with turquoise rings, sweetly touching the trousers of her white-haired and goateed 60-year-old companion. When her eyes unexpectedly met Claude's, she looked away as if unaccountably embarrassed. The white man sat with great dignity, his goatee as finely chiseled as his delicate face. Claude wondered if the woman was Ruth John's aunt, the one who had returned to the reservation after living in California for 30 years, the one who said that she was here to take care of her aged parents. Near the microphone sat the white preacher, rigid with what Claude suspected was a pretense of appreciation, waiting for his time to address the skimpy audience, earnest, patient. With him, his pink-clad wife fussed over the stern-looking old lady at her side. Their presences a sort of oblation of the religious present, and all of them, in Claude's mind at least, mere pathetic surrogates for the providential spirits of the land, which Claude knew to be indigenous to this place. Claude, the only young dancer present at this early morning Christian gathering, thought the music sounded a little raunchy for Sunday morning, but maybe he was in the mood for it. In any case, the music had invited him, so it seemed. It was rhythmic Jesus Comes music in country blues style, the sort of music that had gained much popularity on the reservation in recent times. The young dancer leaned his elbows on the cut-off poles that fenced in the arena, and drained and gaunt with loneliness, he listened to "Lord, What Can I Do" songs, one right after the other. As his eyes scanned the grounds, Claude watched baseball players from Little Wound, early for the game, lounge at the food stands, and later he couldn't take his gaze from the tall, slim Dakota woman wearing sunglasses who strolled her baby on the curved rise of the entrance to the grounds. The baby stared straight ahead, and the woman eased herself and the stroller toward the camp area. She struck Claude as a particularly self-possessed young woman. It was in her walk, her long legs stretching and swaying, and suddenly he wished that he had married Julia, and that such a baby as this was one that he might claim as his own, and that he could see into the eyes of this anonymous woman, and that she would smile. This was the first dance in 3 years that Julia hadn't accompanied him. Her enthusiasm for life, her innocent astonishment, her laughter, which always transformed his natural gloom, her grace and sparkle gone. Today? Yesterday? When was it? She told him, crying, that she wouldn't stay. He had always known that she would someday leave him. And when she did, he acted offhand, casual, as though life would go on as usual. Now, he leaned and listened, his sorrow profound, hidden. Claude squinted into the sky. Then he looked out toward the water. In his early childhood days, Claude had come to know every part of this river, every bend and turn, every fluvial characteristic of the land. He knew the places where the bank turned soft and treacherous. He knew how to anticipate the changing and shifting drop-offs as he swam. He knew where to catch the finest catfish. He had walked on the river's frozen surface in winter. But now, the entire landscape was changed. There were no trees lining this river anymore. No wild plums turning ripe in July. No blue racers lying hidden in the brush. There were only vast blue man-made waters behind the hydropower dam near the agency, and power boats on the waves. After the hydropower dams were constructed on this magnificent body of water, which even now continued to be fed by its tributaries, the river never froze over again in winter, and all things were changed irrevocably. Claude's thoughts of Julia and his memories of the past seemed encased in cocoons made more brittle by what he began to see and understand as disasters of the modern world, hydropower dams flooding Indian land, stern fundamentalist preachers taking the place of Catholic fathers, church guitars and country singers belting out religious songs, and Julia. The sky sparkled just a bit, and the whitecaps on the vast expanse of water started to billow and swell, and the wind rose. It was the clearest blue day. Part 2. Where the roses never fade, sang the serene girl in the black pork pie hat, her black skin gleaming as shiny as the tight black leather-like slacks she wore. She stood between the long-haired, unkempt-looking Indian sax player and the lead guitarist, and her left foot tapped out the rhythm ever so softly. As newcomers straggled in the empty arbor, she left the trio and picked up Christian songbooks and walked spiritlessly across to each newcomer to hand him or her a hymnal. As she passed Claude, she held one out to him, but he turned a shoulder to her and pretended an interest in the horizon. "Come to the Lord, where the roses never fade," she mouthed, her voice scarcely a whisper. She felt the sudden monumental emptiness that made it difficult for her to go on. Nonetheless, she rejoined the group at the microphone and once again looked her companions in song full in the face and began to welcome the clear blue day that she had chosen to give to Jesus. She watched the young Indian dancer as he stared at a woman in sunglasses placidly strolling her baby across the grounds, and she put her head down, closed her eyes, and sang with renewed fervor. She remembered now her sanguine expectations as she reached for the telephone that night in Albuquerque had turned to relief when she heard that her assignment in missionary work was to be on a Northern Plains Indian reservation. She had always wanted to work with Indians, even though she recognized that in such cases where poverty was rampant, sacrifice and virtue in the name of God's work might go unappreciated. Her belief was that she was significantly inspired and dedicated, and she could rise above any obstacles. "American Indians are the needliest of all God's creatures," Reverend told her. "And now that you are finished with your divinity training, you can offer yourself to them and to Jesus." She was ready. She had audaciously and hurriedly packed her Toyota with her few belongings. She had driven almost straight north out of New Mexico, finally making her way through endless prairie grasslands until she caught sight of the largest body of water she'd seen in several days of travel. The new Missouri River in all its splendor formed into a huge lake at the head of a large hydropower dam, one of several such sites along its vast length. "It's beautiful," she had exclaimed to no one in particular. Throughout the months and years that followed, the memory of that moment never dimmed in the mind of the young woman, in spite of the harsh realities of Christian missionary life on the reservation in the modern world. Sadly, her own personal enthusiasm eventually turned into a quiet despair. "There's not the ready acceptance of the Lord's teaching that I had envisioned," she told the Reverend, who telephoned her from his Utah headquarters for bi-monthly reports. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well, they come if we've got something to give the children, like food or gifts, but otherwise they seem uninterested. Reverend Thompson seems very unhappy here," she went on, "and his wife and mother-in-law just stay in the house all the time." "Don't be discouraged," she was told over and over again. She didn't confide in her mentor that she found herself bored with the lives these people lived, and that it had become a remarkable fact that she seldom talked to them about Jesus and his compassion and wisdom anymore. Rather, she had begun talking endlessly about herself to anyone who would listen, told stories about her own childhood near Carlsbad, growing up black in New Mexico, and how she had been poor, and how her mother had deserted the family of 7 children. And now it was Sunday, the last day of Huachipi. "Turn to page 73, the young black woman said into the microphone, her voice suddenly hollow and impersonal. Diminishing the other sounds, her voice rang into the clear blue day. Where could I go but to the Lord, she sang. Number 3. The old man sat alone in the sun, exclusive, solitary. His gray hair was loose and it hung untidily over his shoulders under a battered, aged, and unadorned Stetson. He wore mustard-colored cowboy boots, and one heel kept time to the gospel music. His face was one of those faces that one sees in photographic extravaganzas, an expression of the classic image of American Indians, his bronzed hauteur somehow out of place at this pathetic gathering of Christians. His unposed and incongruous presence a tribute to the survival of a people assaulted for centuries by a confused mixture of racial hatred and good intentions. He accepted the hymnal thrust into his hands by the young black woman in shiny slacks, and then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and silently followed along on all the songs that were sung throughout the morning. Every now and then he lowered his head and closed his eyes wearily and swayed imperceptibly to the rhythm of the music. This was the last day of Huachipi, and the old man, a renowned traditional singer and dancer of the Huacpecute, was tired. During the previous 2 days, he had carried the eagle feather flag for the opening ceremonies, and he had danced almost without interruption, and later, when he had given the communal prayer, he had sung a very old song of courage that his grandfather had taught him, a song that had not been heard for 50 years in a gathering like this. Today he was tired, and he sat resting, listening easily to the Christian hymns, the thumping of the guitar and saxophone, and he felt vaguely happy. Behind the old man, the white caps on the gray-blue waters flashed and dipped. The sun blazed, and it was the clearest blue day. Number 4. Corporeal, substantial, rhythmic, the long line of dancers streamed into the arbor, making its way slowly and inexorably toward the east to form the sacred circle. Like a large natural flow of water, the dancers representing the people, the Dakotapi, poured into the dance arbor, each one brilliantly painted and adorned, carefully stepping in time to the drum, heeding the heartbeats of their own humanity and the humanity of all generations. The weary old man had abandoned his Stetson and the yellow cowboy boots, and now, showing no signs of fatigue, he followed the flags, his body shaking with intense and animated preoccupation with the dance. He was resplendent in porcupine hair, quills, eagle feathers, and beaded regalia. His crouched stance and the tilt of his head carefully imitated the dance of his ancestors, whose feet had touched this sacred ground as long ago as memory and imagination could distinguish. Youthful male dancers moved in and out of the line like feeding and discharging tributaries, converging and separating along the course of the movement of the major stream. Traditional female dancers, lustrous in buckskin and shell and bone and beads, like the flashing and dipping waves of the river in the distance, emerged into the noon sun, stately symbols of fidelity and truth. Claude felt the drumbeats, and his eyes, shaded by sunglasses now, glistened. Tall and disdainful, his forehead painted crimson, he was absorbed in the motion and the sound of the processional. He had forgotten Julia. He had forgotten the disasters of the modern world. He was dancing as his grandfathers had danced in the sun, and it was the clearest blue day. The hills in the distance were white and brown and green. Claude closed his eyes momentarily, and he knew that the hills were there, and they cradled the terrible river in accordance with some reasonable and primeval order. His feet touched the earth in time with the drum, in harmony with his heartbeat, in time with history and the present and his heartbeat. He danced with the others, and in so doing, he drew the hills and the river and the people into one. He and the others came here, this blue day, to do this thing, as had been done always by the people. I guess that's a story which gives you some idea of what I think about the ceremonials and the dances and the songs. I find it interesting that when you look at how it is that literary critics and readers read literature, that we have a very often different interpretation of things. And of course that's all right. I think that very often people who read literature interpret it one way, the author interprets it a different way, and the literary critic interprets it still a third way. And those things, I think, happen. One of the reasons that it's nice for me to come and give a reading to you today is because I can tell you what I think I'm doing. Which isn't always what others think I'm doing. I don't know how many of you are all that much interested in the discussion about literature these days, and the canon and the debate about the changing of the old ways in which literature is taught. I just have come back from the University of California, Davis, where there is a monumental anger concerning the business of changing the literary canon and saying that black writers should be included, that American Indian writers should be included, that Asian writers, women, should now be included. For so very long, you know, we read just a certain kind of literature, especially in American literature and in English literature and in French. And I suppose that's got to change. When you look at what we have thought the function of literature was for so many years, we used to think that literature had explicit meaning. Those of you who read Matthew Arnold back in the old days, that literature has explicit meaning. We moved away from that, of course, into the idea that it has some kind of implicit meaning, you know, T.S. Eliot and all those people in the middle of the 19th century. And now finally we have come to listening to all of these French critics. You know, the French are the only people who say anything interesting about literature anyway. They are not, I guess, Puritans is one of the reasons. We now have come to the point, I guess, where we're thinking that literature has unintended meaning, you know. That's what Derrida and Foucault and all those people are now talking about. So I think that the unintended meaning of literature is wonderful. I mean, I really think that people who read literature and people who study it should really, glom onto that idea. It's a neat idea, I think, that there is all this unintended stuff going on. Thank God, that you don't have to just depend on the narrow view of some writer. Well, I do have another little piece to read. I mentioned that I have written a sequel to a novel which nobody has read. And so you must read this one, and get ready for the sequel. This is called From the River's Edge, and there is a character in this novel that I just couldn't let go of, and her name is Aurelia. And she is not what the story is about, but she turned out to be a rather interesting character, and I didn't want to stop talking about her. So I then decided that I would go on with the story. This story ends in 1968, and it has all kinds of history in it, but it really takes place in the mid-60s, and it ends in 1968. And it was just before the American Indian movement, and it ends before a lot of the things that those of you who are young people in classes today are concerned about and know about. The manuscript is in my publisher's offices in New York, and I don't know if they will publish it or not. I haven't heard from them. So who knows what will happen to it. But it is, I think, my effort to continue the story. That's what it's all about, after all. I mean, even, and I've always known that, I guess. I mean, even the title of this little book, Then Badger Said This, indicates that the story must continue. Because Badger is not an important figure in Lakota literature. He's not like Unktomi or Coyote or somebody like that. He's just always there. And he is asked questions and he answers them, and sometimes he's right and sometimes he's wrong. And he sort of just keeps the plot moving, when there's some kind of silence, and then Badger says something, And so that's what I think, writers ought to be doing, say something, folks, even if it's wrong. So anyway, I want to read you this last piece, which tells some more about the story From the River's Edge, and this story is called The Circle of Dancers. So far, that's what it's called, but from my past experience, it may be changed a couple of times before we ever see it in print. It takes up some of the characters in the first novel. In the first novel, there are two brothers. There's Jason and Sheridan Big Pipe, and they represent the kind of younger generation. They are, I suppose, the people who must carry on after the flooding of the river after the termination relocation era and after many of the devastating things that have occurred in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So this, I think there are three little parts to it, number 9 and number 10 and number 11. And then maybe we'll have time for some more coffee. I should say, I guess, that one of the brothers has been accused of murder, and he is out on bail, finally, after months. And Jason and Aurelia are not married yet, but they are thinking of doing that. Number 9.